Thank you, Tim, for those kind words of introduction, and thank you, Joe, for the invitation to speak here today. Although I must say it's not a comfortable position for me. In the last 5 years, I've gotten used to writing speeches, not giving speeches, so please bear with me. So I would like to start where Brandon finished. And so that quote by Yeats from The Second Coming, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. These lines are quoted in the opening of The Revenge of Passions, the latest book published by the eminent French theorist of international relations, who died 2 months ago, Pierre Hasner. And, well, Pierre was also, for me, a dear friend. And the reason I want to evoke Pierre Hasner today is double. First of all, discussions on values often tend to be overly abstract. And for any invocation of European values to be more than stale incantation, there is a need, I believe, for those values to have been passed on in a meaningful and living fashion. So for me personally, belonging as I do to a generation who grew up with democracy as the norm, a generation who did not experience war or the deprivation of freedom, a deeply seated awareness of the vital importance of the European values of pluralism, human dignity, freedom of thought came indirectly. So it came through encounters with the poignant writings of people such as Primo Levi or Czesław Miłosz, Kołakowski, another great Polish writer, Wassily Grossman, and others who all wrote in a very poignant way about the totalitarian experience. It also came through my living for over a year in Republika Srpska, the Serb republic within the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I encountered not just men and women who had just gone through a war, and a war with their former brothers and neighbors within the Yugoslav Federation, but also where I encountered men and veterans who were widely held as the villains of that war. You may recall that Mladic and the Bosnian Serb army were the people who perpetrated the crimes of Srebrenica. And finally, my awareness of the crucial significance of humanist European values came through friendships with people such as Pierre Hasner, who was a survivor of the worst political experiences of the 20th century, and somebody who was keenly aware of the frailty of democracy. He went through several changes of regime in Europe, and indeed his parents were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, spoke German and so on. So the second reason why I wanted to spend a few minutes speaking about Pierre Hasner today is because both his life and his work, which was centered on passions and their role in shaping international relations, go to the heart of our subject this afternoon. Raymond Aron, another eminent French theorist of international relations, once said that anybody who thinks that peoples follow their interests rather than their passions understood nothing about the 20th century, to which Pierre added in his last book, nor about the 21st century. And indeed, in this work in particular, he studied the contemporary rise of religious fundamentalism, jihadism, and he reflected upon the means to prevent a dialectic of the extremes. For example, Can you hear me? Yeah. So in that book, Pierre studied the means to avoid a dialectic of the extremes, namely the escalation between opposite religious passions, but also the escalation between religious passion on the one hand and the passion for secularism on the other. In 1989 already, Pierre Hassner had written a response to his friend Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, with which some of you might be familiar. So that essay was published in the journal The National Interest, and in it Fukuyama described the advent of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government and the end point of historical evolution. Yet for this to be true, Pierre emphasized, would also require the final extinction of the thumos, that part of the soul which for the old Greeks was the seat of honor and rage and the thirst for recognition. In a 1991 article, Hassner observed that while universal values and liberal democracy seem to be triumphing in the wake of the collapse of Soviet communism, we must not forget that the aspirations which led to nationalism and socialism, namely the yearning for community and identity on the one hand, and that for equality and solidarity, have not gone away. And he questioned the ability of liberalism to combine and reconcile those two sets of aspirations with pluralism and individual freedoms. And indeed today, such reconciliation seems less and less real. The yearning for equality, which per se is rather a positive passion, is being whipped up into a rejection of European integration by some left-wing populist leaders who view the EU as no more than a capitalist conspiracy. And above all, as Brendan described, what we are witnessing is a surge of negative passions for identity and community in the guise of a right-wing nativism which manifests itself either negatively in a defensive form through an impulse towards cultural homogenization and closure, or in an offensive manner through the pursuit of domination, or in a milder form, revenge and recognition. And indeed, from Hungary to the US, what we see is the rise of far-right political trends which rely on the use of force in negotiations. So we are witnessing a genuine brutalization of international relations. We are also seeing attempts at leading society through repression, through the mobilization of negative passions, which Eli Halevi called the organization of enthusiasm, and as Brendan described too, through the cult of the leader. That is a magical or mystical identification between the leader and the people in the singular, and the people being an undifferentiated body politic. So one might think of the style of Erdogan's power in Turkey, and Putin's Russia also follows this model. According to Russian ethnologist Emil Payne, who is a former advisor to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, the nature of Putin's power over the Russian people is comparable to that of the African healers studied by Evans Pritchard. So it is against this backdrop, against the backdrop of Pierre Hassner's work on passions and their role, that I will now come back to Europe and to the liberal trends currently at work within the European Union. So I will start by describing a few facts and then move on to principles and values. So you may know that Hegel once, or used to say rather, that reading the newspapers is the realist's morning prayer. And in that same spirit, you could say that philosophy is his evening prayer. So I will try to combine the two prayers and go from facts to philosophical foundations. So I initially wanted to illustrate my remarks with examples taken from Poland and Hungary, the two countries which are leading the charge today in Europe against liberal democracy. But time is short, and John will be speaking about Poland later on. So I will content myself with talking about Hungary, because I believe that Hungary is arguably the member state in which attacks on the rules of law, and importantly the theorization or the conceptual legitimization of illiberal state building by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán are the most advanced. So we can come back perhaps to the case of Poland during the Q&A session if you wish. So I start by observing that the onslaught against the values of pluralism and liberalism by the political leaders of the so-called Visegrad Group seem in many ways an ironic or cruel twist of history, coming from two of the countries, or from several, because there was Czechoslovakia too, but coming from those countries who had been at the forefront of the resistance against Soviet oppression after 1945. As you may remember, the Visegrad Group had been formed immediately after the demise of communism by Presidents Václav Havel, Lech Wałęsa and Arpad Gönc. And that group initially stood for democratization and the shared goal of European integration. So back then, Visegrad meant orientation towards Western-type liberal democracy. And indeed, in Central Europe, running parallel with the emergence of the dissident movements of the 1970s and 1980s, was the affirmation of cultural belonging to Western Europe and to the West. Kundera famously described Central Europe in terms of a kidnapped West. So, for years in those countries, the conversion to liberalism, the construction of open societies went hand in hand with the assertion of European identity. And today, it is precisely the complementary character of those two elements which is being challenged. So the political leaders of the Visegrad Group have reopened an East-West divide within the EU over the definition of national and European identity, and revolving in particular around the issue of the migrant crisis, which began in 2015. When Viktor Orbán and Jarosław Kaczyński met in Krynica in October 2016, they called for a counter-revolution in Europe. So while before 1989, Czech and Polish dissidents would meet in the mountains at the border to discuss democratic change, we now see two former dissidents, for both Kaczynski and Orbán are former dissidents, meet in the same Tatra mountains to call for a revolt against liberal, multicultural, permissive and decadent Europe in a language that is not far from Putin's. So more precisely, what shaped is that counter-revolution taking in Hungary? So in Hungary, as in Poland, this counter-revolution is enacted through successive constitutional revisions. And that might be a point for the discussion, but there are tensions around the democratic constitutions which those countries adopted in the 1990s, and those tensions keep surging. So after winning a third consecutive supermajority in the 2018 general elections, Viktor Orbán announced that it would implement a Seventh Amendment of the Hungarian Constitution by revisiting in particular Article 4 and by stating that, I quote, foreign populations should not be settled on the territory of Hungary. And by foreign populations, he means non-EU citizens. And this follows from the October 2015 referendum, in which 98% of Hungarian voters said no to forced relocation quotas for migrants. And it is also important to remember that the so-called Stop Soros legislative package aimed at countering the relocation of migrants in Hungary is also on the table. So Soros, or George Soros, is that banker or financier of Hungarian origin who made a fortune in the 1980s, now lives in the US and is funding many pro-democracy liberal NGOs across Europe and indeed across the world. And he's the uber enemy for the contemporary Hungarian government. So there is that Stop Soros package on the table, and the Fidesz, so Fidesz being the political party of Viktor Orbán, initially a center-right party. So the Fidesz campaign was run mainly on the need to fight the imaginary plan that was a complete fake news, the imaginary plan of George Soros, but also of Angela Merkel and the EU Commission, to repopulate Europe with migrants of Muslim origin in an attempt to change Europe's ethnic and religious makeup. So Soros is really the ideal scapegoat in that context. He's a global capitalist. He was a student of Karl Popper at the London School of Economics in the 1950s. And as you know, Karl Popper is the author, is a famous German philosopher who wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies. And that is a book that really is at the foundation of George Soros's vision of the world. And in election posters in Hungary a few months ago, one could see Soros with a kind of a sardonic smile, and that is really a trope, the trope of the smiling Jew, which evokes, a trope that was widely used by Nazi propaganda during the Second World War. So there's many very warring undertones to that campaign. So constitutional revisions. Then there's another aspect in what's going on in Hungary is the erosion of checks and balances. So the number of ombudsmen was reduced from 4 to 1. There's been a series of attacks on the independence of courts. So there's now judges of the Constitutional Court who were appointed by Fidesz, the main party. A Fidesz loyalist was also appointed as prosecutor general, with the effect that the number of investigations into state corruption dropped drastically after 2010. The media have also undergone an unprecedented state-led centralization that is really reminiscent of the Cold War salami tactics. And the effect of that is that the Hungarian media today are entirely dominated by oligarchs who were close to Fidesz. So Fidesz today control the public broadcaster, but also all the major private and national newspapers. And another tool used by the ruling party to shape public opinion is the allocation of advertising through state subsidiaries. As a result, the Hungarian public space is saturated today with anti-Western, anti-immigration, pro-Russian, which is ironic again, pro-Russian rhetoric built on an unprecedented mass of fake news and conspiracy theories, framing independent NGOs and the political opposition as enemies of the nation. So this is an illustration of what Brandon was describing. And that type of rhetoric, the binary opposition between patriots and enemies of the nation, is one that is also very present in Poland. So I was in Poland recently, and I found that very, very striking. Anybody who is not in line with the ruling party positions is held as a second-class citizen, an enemy of the nation, a traitor, etc. So what we see is really the rise of an atmosphere which is reminiscent of what Carl Schmitt described, the definition of politics as being defined by an opposition between friend and enemy, and not at all a pluralist political culture. So another important aspect, of course, of the charge against liberal democracy in Hungary is, of course, the attacks on civil society. So, well, I won't go into detail, I do not have time, but the Hungarian parliament adopted an anti-NGO law that is modeled on the Russian regulation. And so now all foreign-funded organizations must be registered on grounds of national security. So again, the government's attacks on NGOs is framed on an as an anti-immigration issue. There's also, well, as you may know, the Central European University is also under attack. And an important element is the role of clientelism and corruption in Hungary. So systemic corruption has become the government's main tool for resource distribution to create a loyal elite as well as an economically dependent nationwide electorate. And so that is key, because that is also European funds being the main resource for the for the Hungarian regime. European funding amounting to almost 29 billion for the period 2014-2020. Perhaps the EU has a tool there, but a double-edged one. So the operation of this system of corruption and clientelism is grounded in a quasi-feudal dependency on the ruling party, and we see a new string of pro-government oligarchs contributing to the long-term survival of the Hungarian liberal regime. And that is important. Like all the measures that are taken in Hungary at the moment are really long-term measures. Appointments have been extended, so all those in power have mandates that run for between 9 to 12 years. So Orbán's horizon is a long-term one. So before I move on to my conclusion, I would like to invite you to read Orbán's speeches, because Orbán has actually theorized very clearly his enterprise. So one important speech he made was in Tusnádförde on the 26th of July 2014. And I will just quote a few lines from that speech, because they speak for themselves. So I quote, "We need to courageously state a sentence that is considered to be a sacrilege in the liberal world order. We need to state that a democracy is not necessarily liberal. Just because a state is not liberal, it can still be a democracy. We want to organize a workfare state in Hungary that will undertake the odium of expressing that in character it is not of a liberal nature. People want democratic societies, not open societies." So this ties with what Brandon was describing, and it is indeed the key divide today. And in the wake, well, actually, on the morning after Donald Trump's election victory, Viktor Orbán gave an interview in which he said, which was also, by the way, the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So he said, "Liberal non-democracy is over. What a day, what a day, what a day." Then he described Brexit as a knock on the door. And with the election of Donald Trump, Viktor Orbán said that we have now crossed the threshold. And Orbán really felt vindicated. So saying, "You were pointing the finger at us. We were the vanguard And indeed, when we see what is happening today in Italy, well, we can see that Europe is really at a very perilous juncture. And the last speech I would invite you to read is a speech that Viktor Orban gave very recently in homage to Helmut Kohl. So he was invited to give that speech by Helmut Kohl's widow. And I think that is an important speech because we can see how there is really quite a wide offensive on the Christian democratic foundations of Europe. So the project is really that of a new definition of European identity, a new brand of nativism that is predicated upon the relegation of non-nationals and a simplistic reassertion of full national sovereignty as being the key to all social, economic, and cultural evils. And that agenda is one that is at odds, that is indeed radically incompatible with the vision of the world and the ethical impulse upon which Christian democracy was built in Europe after the war. So I think one of the key problems we are facing today is also is reflected within the European People's Party, the EPP. So we see the problems that Merkel is having with the CSU. If in France, we also see a right wing who is more and more, I wouldn't say contaminated, but let's say being colonized by the ideas of the far right, and this is something we see across Europe. So I'll conclude. So I think to respond to those challenges is a very difficult task. Because, as Brandon said, we lived in a world that is not, I wouldn't say that it's the rise of a new order, it's a new disorder. I mean, the key problem is disorder, uncertainty, complexity. So, and we have indeed those game changers, but I think what really is at stake is that it's very difficult to predict the trajectory of the encounter between different game changers. Raymond Aron analyzed World War I, saying that what mattered was the surprise element in the chain of events. So not so much the series of diplomatic errors which led to World War I, but then the surprise of the technical element, the technical power which led to the prolongation of the war, and then well, all the authoritarian regimes and eventually to World War II. So again, today we have that encounter between new ideas, new projects, new upheavals as migration and the cyber revolution. And this is, I think, really key. So my hope is that we will continue to build on the acquis that the peoples of Europe have forged over the past 60 years. We must continue to build on the experience of those many years of shared institutional and legislative practice, on the tools of cooperation, of solidarity we have created together as Europeans, and also on the ability we have developed to look at any nation, to look at any issue of common interest from different angles through the eyes of other nations. And I'll conclude by quoting a Polish philosopher, Kołakowski, who said, "No, the struggle between the devil and God in history is not a merry spectacle. The only comfort we have comes from the simple fact that we are not passive observers or victims of this contest, but participants as well, and therefore our destiny is decided on the field on which we run." Thank you.